The Lord be with you. And also with you. Let us pray. Almighty and gracious God, I give you thanks for this night. I give you thanks for the imagination of how we might see and perceive our calling in this world as Christian. I pray that you be with us tonight. I pray that you dwell among us. I pray that you make our faces shine like the sun. I pray all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Alrighty, everyone. So I want to pick up today with where we left off last week. So you'll recall that we started with the prehistory of Genesis. And this prehistory of Genesis is a saga of sort of exemplar archetypal stories that fit what's going on for the rest of the scriptures. That in this prehistory, which is Genesis 1 through 11, the primary stories we get are creation, round 1, creation, round 2, good job, okay, which we commonly call the Garden of Eden. We have the fall narrative, which is Genesis 3. Cain and Abel, which is Genesis 4. Genesis 5 has a very interesting genealogy that goes 10 generations from Adam down to Noah. Couple fun facts about this bit is that if you add up all of the years that in there, I forget what it totals up to, but it is equal to 360 times 28. So in other words, a solar cycle times a lunar cycle. And that it is about, they would call it an aeon, and it would be a whole generational turnover. Which is affirmed by the genealogy itself, because when you do the math, Noah is the first person recorded after the death of Adam. That it says everyone in the 9 generations above Noah essentially had the potential to have known Adam as sort of this prototypical creation. But then Noah is the one that comes in after Adam is gone, perhaps a prototypical new Adam. Which is, again, just a very interesting piece of it. You also get the stories of the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth that culminate in Tubal-Cain, who was a fairly arrogant fellow. His whole shtick was that if God's going to forgive my ancestor Cain for basically killing his brother, I can do whatever I want because God will forgive me. Right? That's... Yeah, I was going to say, it's an interesting thing. So we have that. Then we have the flood narrative, which is essentially Genesis 6 through 9. And then Genesis 10 is another genealogy. And then we have the Tower of Babel, which I will acknowledge we did not really talk about last time. But for the sense of our story, I think that we'll be okay to just sort of pause on that. We talked about some of the primary things that we recognized in this. In the creation account, that we talked about the parallelism between the vegetation being brought out from the dry land and that the humans being called to be fruitful and multiply, right? Trees have fruit, humans have fruit. And in fact, a lot of imagery about humans throughout the scriptures has to do with humans being trees, okay? And if you don't believe me, consider what Jesus' occupation was. He worked with wood, okay? I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that there's an awful lot pointing to the fullness of this story and how it goes from this imagination of creation and the paradise of Eden. Then we have an expulsion from Eden where we then journey through the wilderness, ultimately to attain a new Eden, a new creation at the end of the story. Can you do me a favor real quick? Can you go get the top of the baptismal font? Thank you. This will play a pivotal role in our story tonight. Okay. So we have that. So we have humans are trees. Humans are vegetation. We also have this understanding of what the human's responsibility is. That the human was taken and placed in the garden to till and to keep it in the midst of the garden at the foot of a tree. And that we imagine our story again, where when you have the Garden of Eden, that it describes that God placed a garden in Eden. Thank you. Appreciate
Just
that.
Casually.
Yeah. This is great. This is great. That we have this garden that gets planted in a land called Eden. The garden, in the garden, 4 rivers flow out from the garden, and then 2 trees are planted at the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, and the man is planted in the garden to till and to keep it. Okay, this imagery is, giant baptismal font in front of you. That will go there. Well, here, I'll keep this up here just for a second. The juxtaposition of the 7 days of creation, sort of this expulsion, and then what happens next, right? That our own baptismal imagery plays on this. That you would have 7 days or 6 days of creation, 1 day of rest, and then at some level it begs the question, what happens on the 8th day? The 8th day is the day of new creation, which is why your baptismal font has 8 sides on the top of it. A very consistent, I can tell y'all with confidence, I didn't go in there to count to make sure that y'all had it, that y'all's had 8 sides, because it's that universally consistent that you can just sort of walk in and it has 8 sides on it, which is an incredible, incredible thing, that this imagery of new creation, of becoming something new in the process of it. So the sin happens, the first sin happens, things fall apart, the man gets taken out of the garden, and he is expelled east of Eden with his wife, right, with the woman, right, and we talk about how there are angels, right, I'm going to have a little angel, right, halo, okay. Weird thing about a flaming sword that is guarding the entrance to Eden. Okay, this is sort of the story. And that at this point, the whole rest of the biblical narrative is about how do we get back to Eden. Everything is journeying towards that one moment. To foreshadow a little bit, right? We're going to spend a whole session sort of reflecting on this. But to consider Jesus. Where was he buried? In a tomb in a garden. When the women go and find him, what do they see at the entrance to the tomb? 2 angels. Not 1 angel, 2 angels. Right? Very specific, 2 angels. Of all the numbers that we could have picked, we picked 2. And that when Mary Magdalene goes on and has a conversation with the first person she talks to, who is it she talks to? The gardener. Okay? The whole gospel message is pointing to this. And that ultimately Leviticus functions as the imagination of how people are meant to get back to it. Jesus is going to change some things about this. But it is going to be the imagination of the people that see what Jesus is doing where it starts taking on a whole new life, right? At this point, we can start to see why Jesus uses tree metaphors a lot, right? Think about the fig tree. Of all the plants that we could have chosen, why the fig tree? Because it's the one that was used to cover the man and the woman. Okay? All of this sort of gets played out in the story, okay? So we have this as the imagination. We're going to skip over Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And at this point, these people whom God has chosen to be the providential people that would bring about the redemption of the world. And I am layering a Christian imagery on that there. They end up in Egypt, and they're in Egypt for 400 years. Life isn't great for them. In fact, they are enslaved. The book of Exodus begins, a new king arose over Egypt who knew not Joseph and his brothers. And that basically he got scared. There's an amazing sequence in the first 4 chapters of Exodus. 7 women are introduced, right? Going back to that biblical number of 7, going back to the imagery of Eve, that set up the ability for Moses' own departure from Egypt. You will recall that Moses goes out, and so he was in a basket, in a baby. His mother places him in a basket, right? Y'all remember this story? Pitch on the inside and the outside. The only other time that word gets used in the Hebrew scriptures is the ark, right? So here we have, right, going back to this prehistory once again. He makes it through, he becomes part of Pharaoh's household, and then he's confronted with a very strange question, a paradox, an ethical question. Who is his brother? Right? Going back to Cain and Abel, am I my brother's keeper? Whose brother is he? That he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and in some cases, he defends his brother by killing the Egyptian, but he simultaneously repeats the sin of Cain by killing his own countrymen, presumably. That this is all sort of meditative literature. Y'all will recall last week I said there are going to be a couple things I say that are going to be like, it's kind of a stretch, okay? Well, here's Moses, right? Here we are sort of getting to explore the paradigm of sort of the prehistory in Moses' own life. He runs out, he flees, he meets his wife at a well, at a high place, and it is there that he joins her household, Jethro, who is a, quote, priest of Midian. Moses then goes on to be a shepherd. And what does he do? He climbs on top of a mountain. Going back to our imagery. What does he see on top of the mountain? A tree that's on fire. And so now he starts talking with God, and we have this sort of exchange. What do I do? Right? And God is very consistent, right? That I have heard the cry of my people in Egypt. I am sending you to let them go that they might worship me. Right? That at some level, the whole purpose is worship. And that is the ends of our liberation in whatever it is. That ultimately it then becomes about communion with God. Because worship in this sense, right, prior to the fall, was about walking with God. Right? Remember the story that they would walk with God in the cool of the day, in the evening breeze. And like, that's what we're shooting for. We're going to struggle to get there, y'all. But, you know, and so he does that. He goes back to Pharaoh. We then have a series of exchanges between Moses and Pharaoh, who happen to be brothers, once again, pulling up this theme of brothers in conflict. One other just sort of interesting tidbit. The first time that the emotion ascribed to God is anger is actually at the burning bush scene. Right? So it's not at the flood. It's not at any of the other terrible things that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. But it is ultimately when Moses says, I don't want to do that. That's when God gets angry. That's when we say no. So just tuck that one away for your own edification. That he goes back to Pharaoh. We have this whole sort of sequence with the plagues culminating in the death of the firstborn. If you have not watched the movie Exodus, Gods and Kings, I would strongly encourage it. It is a very good movie. And it actually ends up having the courage to, I think, ask the question that a lot of people read the Exodus story with, which is, how do you worship a God that does this? Right? There's a courage in asking that question. And we work very hard, I think, to sort of do this whole loving God thing really well, right? And that because of that, we sort of say, well, any of that hard stuff, we're just going to get rid of. We're going to pretend it doesn't exist. And what I've noticed in my studies of the scripture is that the attributes of God that are discussed are ultimately only one-sided. And I say that there's a Jewish tradition that Torah is like a diamond. And if you can imagine a diamond like you might wear on a ring, that as you twist it, there are many faces to that one diamond. But you can only really look at one at a time. That's kind of what the scriptures are like. You only get one piece of God at a time in each little story. And so when we get the question of, well, how do we look at God? How does God do this? How does a loving God kill all the firstborn? Well, we have to look at the story as a whole. That we can just stop there and say, well, this God is maniacal. Or we can say, much like the flood, where people were allowed to make their own choices that ultimately would end in death, is God, and when then God causes the waters to fall down and crash onto the earth, God is just kind of pushing the fast forward button. God is sort of saying, let me show you the fruit of your labor and let me do it like on a time crunch. And so that's kind of what happens in the flood. And so when we get to the story of Moses, the Passover, speaking of floods, that's all right. Okay, so we get this question about Pharaoh sort of poses to Moses about this death that God supposedly unleashes. And it's interesting because we have to recall that this Pharaoh's father had done the exact same thing with the drowning of all the boys in the Nile River. That part of it seems to be God once again holding up a mirror saying, are you as good as you think you are? That, in fact, at some level, his own life, Pharaoh's own life, was spared simply because he assumed that he was better, of a different pedigree than the Hebrews. And we see God holding up a mirror in this. And that, it's the movie itself does a very good job of reflecting on it. We have the death of the firstborn, and then Pharaoh says to Moses, go. And then we know ultimately that he goes, but Pharaoh changes his mind. And that he then sends the people or his chariot drivers after them. And they get to the Red Sea. And then we have this triumphant moment of Moses separating the sea, a wall of water on their right and on their left. And that what happens, dry ground emerges out of it. And that the people walk through the Red Sea on dry land. This sort of incredible moment. You then have Miriam, Moses' sister, start singing a song. We'll sing it on Easter Vigil this year. Alleluia, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has hurled into the sea. And there's this beautiful piece of Jewish midrash that goes with the story. So Miriam is singing this song. The Israelites join in. And the midrash goes that the angels of heaven joined in to join with Miriam and her song. And God turns to the angels and says, silence. How is this that you can sing when one of my creation has been drowned? Talking about Pharaoh and the chariot drivers, right? That even the early Jewish mystics sort of understood the reflective meaning of what was going on behind this story. They move through the Red Sea on dry land. We get the story of the manna. This is chapter 16 with bread. 17, we get some sort of dietary laws. There's Moses that goes up to a rock and splits the rock and water gushes out of it. Again, land being separated, right? Water. And then we get to 18 and then 19, which is where we're going to start today. So this takes place over a 3-month period. So chapters 16 to 19 is a 3-month period. On the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They had journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptian, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. A priestly kingdom and a holy nation." that key phrase right there begins to set up how the Israelites are to perceive themselves in this grand narrative of God's story. That ultimately what we are going to see, and this is sort of fundamental to us today, is that the high priest, Aaron and his sons, are going to be this to the Levites. The Levites will follow the same relationship to the Israelites. And then the Israelites will ultimately function like this unto the nations of the world. And our architecture in the church actually communicates this really well. When the altar came out from the wall, we lost a little bit of the symbolism of what's being taught here. But if you imagine the church, high altar against a wall, right? God like lives in the box up here, okay? Y'all remember the box, okay? All right, you got the box, you got the priest, you've got the congregation, and then you've got the whole world out here. And that in a way, and I understand why this is uncomfortable for us today, but I think this is really important to the imagination, one, of how they're looking at it, but two, also a way for us to perceive it, is that in the same way that a priest functions quasi like an intermediary on behalf of the congregation, right? That when we do the Eucharistic prayer, I know y'all are doing prayer C right now, and so there's a little more call and response in it. But in prayers A, B, and D, right, the priest is saying all the words, and the one word we're not allowed to say is Amen. That's y'all's job, right? And that's how we do priests do this intermediary thing on behalf of the congregation. But what that says is that as soon as we say, go in peace to love and serve the Lord, y'all are now standing at the altar on behalf of the world. And that, right, that the same priestly vocation that I experience in part of my day-to-day life at some level is the same priestly vocation that the baptized are called to in their ministry. And whether it's what we do in our day-to-day life, right, whether that's job, volunteer work, retirement, just, I don't know, going to play golf, right? Like whatever that happens to be, that we are to be intermediaries and intercessors on behalf of the world. I think at some level there's a grace that the pivot point. I know. Does Pilar do announcements at the after the confession or at the peace? Okay, so the prayer book allows the announcements to take place in a couple places, and that is admittedly, I think, the most convenient spot to do it. But imagine going straight from the creed to the prayers to the confession into the sursum corda. Right, you do the peace and you do the sursum corda. And there isn't like a timeout, okay, which is kind of how announcements get experienced. That under the 28 prayer book, you would actually do the prayers of the people after the peace. That you would have the peace, you would do the prayers of the people, and then you'd move straight into the Eucharistic prayer, which was literally the people praying on behalf of the world that the priest then took all the way up to God. Okay? And again, right, I'm not taking a position where priests are the only people that can talk to God. But I'm saying that symbolically the function of what's happening is that we are gathering all of the prayers of all the stuff that y'all do during the week, and we're saying, okay, God, like we're giving this to you, right? It's kind of like a funnel, if you will. And that this vocational aspect becomes what Israel does, that they are meant to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Which means everybody, right, from Aaron and his sons all the way down to whatever miscellaneous, like, I don't know, Benjaminite, that's just like floating around, right? They have a role to play on behalf of the world. And if you read Paul carefully in Romans, I think this is what he's antagonizing about Israel, is that they didn't do it. They took their set-apart status and hoarded it, rather than sharing it, right? There is a reason we are called to be evangelists, and that learn our lesson. This is what happens when we don't embrace our call to evangelism. That we are meant to draw people into this fellowship, because ultimately, I would then suggest that through Jesus, right, and this is part of the importance of Leviticus in the imagination of the disciples of Paul, of Jesus, is that eventually they're going to scratch out Israelite here and they're going to put baptized Christian. And that will be their expression for the life of the world. Because at this point, right, so remember with Noah and the flood, there are 8 people left over. Noah and his wife, 3 sons, their wives, 8 people. And that God makes a covenant with them that all of their descendants would be blessed. Which, if you're doing the math, they're the only 8 people. That means everybody on the earth today is a descendant of one of those 8 people. Which says, right, that they're involved in this. The nations are part of it. And that Jesus seems to take it from a local, national thing. I would argue that this is why Christian nationalism fails the Christian litmus test of it. Is that when it becomes ethnocentric, it fails to be Christian. And that is just, I don't know, basic biblical interpretation at that point. Okay, so we have a holy priest and a holy nation. The next thing that happens is that he goes in and Moses goes up the mountain and he gets the 10 commandments. And we've heard these before, 10 rules for holy living, okay? He goes up. There are a couple other things that get talked about. Part of this is the construction of the tabernacle. Keep in mind that papyrus scrolls, whatever scroll, lambskin scroll, was expensive. And they are not going to waste space creating a shopping list, unless that shopping list is very important. They spend 3 chapters telling you exactly what that is supposed to look like, down to the fiber and the design that you are supposed to weave into it. They spend those 3 chapters telling you how to do it. They then spend another 3 chapters saying, and Moses did it just like this. He used this color thread. He wove this design, right? They are very intentional that this is God's dwelling place. And ultimately, how this is going to get set up is that you are going to have my, right, north, south, east, west. You are going to have a courtyard. The tent of meeting, also known as the tabernacle, that is divided between the holies and the holy of holies. There's going to be a shroud that separates the two. Within the Holy of Holies, you're going to have the Ark of the Covenant. Includes in it the copy of the 10 Commandments, some manna, Moses' staff, and something else. The holy dice, right? They were big on dice at this time. Those lived in there. And on top of it was what was known as the mercy seat, which is the top of the box of the covenant. What was it decorated with? So glad you asked. 2 angels, right? So go back to Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, okay? That box is the box that's in there, okay? Then in the holies, you would have the altar of incense. You would have a bread table with 12 loaves of bread on it. And then you would have a 7-armed menorah that would be lit perpetually. And that those are sort of the 4 things that are inside. Then, hey, 2 for 2. We would have a wash basin, and then we would have the altar. And I'm going to just go ahead. All right, and so you can see, right, this lovely little model. We have our seraphim, our angels standing at the back, okay? Inside, we have the Ark of the Covenant with our mercy seat on the top. Inside, you can see all the little things that they have to offer, okay? So that goes in the Holy of Holies. We have our menorah, 7 lampstands. We've got our bread table with our 12 loaves of bread, one for each of the tribes of Israel. We've got our altar of incense, where incense would be perpetually offered. So thinking about some of the stories that we have, we, on February 2nd, celebrated Candlemas. We had the story of Simeon going into the altar, or that he was in there. I'm sorry, I'm thinking the wrong story.
Presentation of Jesus.
Yeah, the presentation. So going back to John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist, his father, Zechariah, was a Levite. He was supposed to be in the temple. And that he was actually going in to light the incense. That was his job when he was silenced by God. So this is what he was doing. At the entrance to the temple, so you've got all the different fabrics and things that are woven into it that would be laid over it. We have our wash basin and we have our altar. And it's here at the altar that all the animals would be slaughtered. And then you can see there was space underneath it to light a fire. And then you would burn things to there. And when we get actually into Leviticus, which is what we are going to get to today, we're going to talk about the 5 types of sacrifices that would be done, okay? Because they each had a different purpose and function. There is, again, some very strong similarities between our own architecture and churches today and what's going on here. Would be a little bit better if we saw it like that, where we have an altar and we have a baptismal font. And then it's so nice that we have our area up here past the altar and sort of the high altar area, that we have the tabernacle, which is sort of where we keep our bread, that we have a number of candles that fit this bill. Once upon a time, I'm sure incense was a more frequent thing, that it would be perpetually there. And that it starts mirroring the structure really well, right? If we can make meaning out of this physical space that we have here, when we see the historical imagination of it, the space begins to take on even more meaning. That geography in the church is at some level very much meant to mirror this.
How was the wash basin used?
So we will get to that tonight. Okay. We'll get there tonight. It had to do with purification rites.
Where does the altar guild need to meet?
Yeah, where's the altar guild? Right. Yes, where does the altar guild meet? That is a great question. Okay, all right. So there's one other thing that I want us to reflect on, and I'm going to pick it up, and that is to recall that ultimately whatever is being sacrificed here is on fire. Okay, which then means when you look down the barrel, in order to get inside the tent and you're outside the courtyard, you're looking over fire. The entrance is guarded by 2 angels. Okay, right? And that is, not to say it's oriented north, south, east, west, if y'all want to go ahead and sit down. Oh yeah, it's like they were trying to do something. So recall that it says that all of this was set up facing east. Right? The entrance to the courtyard was east. The man and the woman were expelled from where? East of Eden. Right? That they are intended to look back this way. We actually turn our churches around the opposite way, because that's the way that it says Jesus is going to come back, that he will come like the rising of the sun. And that's why we've twisted the direction of our churches. So Moses sets all of this up, and it's great. We get the unfortunate incident of the golden calf. Y'all have heard of this one before, right? And they start making an idol. God gets pretty mad about that. Moses has this very interesting interaction where Moses is willing to sacrifice himself on behalf of the Israelites, saying they didn't know what they were doing, because truly he was up on a mountain when he got the rule about not making images. And he says, they didn't know, I will stand as the atoning sacrifice in between them and you. And he offers his life in exchange for them. And God says, it's fine. we'll just move on. Yeah. So we've done that now. And he goes back into the temple. We get some descriptions about the garments that the priests are going to wear. We're going to talk about that next week because guess what? It's identical to what we wear now. And that life is good. So then we get to the final chapter of the book of Exodus. And I'm realizing I probably gave you all the wrong chapter. Did I tell you 39? Yeah. It was meant to tell you 40. I get the two mixed up. Okay. So anyways, they make all of this. Okay, except, right, so they make it all, they set it all up, and then God comes in the form of a cloud and settles over the tent. Okay, settles over the tent. And here's the phrase. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on each stage of their journey. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they could not set out until the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, before the eyes of all the house of Israel at each stage of their journey. So the nice thing about this little setup is that it was transportable. That was part of the design. You could pick it up and you could move it. And so what would happen is that like God would come in a cloud and would sort of like pop up and puddle on over, and then would sort of like settle back down, kind of like a fog. So the Israelites would then wrap all this up. They'd carry it to that spot and they'd set it up again. And they'd stay there until the cloud decided to move again. And that was sort of where it was. This amazing moment, though, of God coming in a cloud, and the verb would be to tabernacle among the people, has a direct connection to our Christmas Eve service. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Dwelt isn't the right word. The literal word means it tabernacled among us, right? It is pulling this imagery, right? Though in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. For he was in the beginning with God. Through him all things came into being, and without him nothing that had been made, or nothing that was made had been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. Skipping ahead a little bit, right? He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. He came to not accept him, but to those who did receive him, who those and believed in his name, he gave them power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. This is the one whom God said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me. And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Right? We are pulling a very direct relationship between Jesus, Moses, the tabernacle, and the Garden of Eden. And that, again, the whole Gospels point to the fulfilling of this. And that in a way that, like, I know that when we walk into churches, we experience a sense of sacredness. Right? There's something going on in that building that makes it even different from this building. Lots of churches get to make that claim. Right? Lots of churches get to say there's something special going on here. For these folks at this time, it happened in this room. That was it. Nowhere else. And in fact, they would actually orient the entire community around it. You had the Levites who were in the first realm, and then you had the other tribes around the Levites that would form the camp. It was the center of their life, physically. Before I moved into parish ministry, I was a boarding school chaplain, and in some ways, it was kind of what you would imagine this to be. The chapel was in the very center of campus. The academic buildings were around it. The dorms were around them. And that when we gathered, it was all here. And I can't say that the pious religious life of the community was all that high. But had it been, it would have been an incredible little place. Because, right, that when you have this geography, it centers you on what's really important. And so Moses, the cloud comes, settles on this. Moses, though, is stuck on the outside looking in. But he can't go in. He can't go in because of the golden calf issue. And so we've got to find a way, how do we do that? So now, the tent, the cloud descends, it tabernacles on the tabernacle, and Moses is stuck. Okay, he's not allowed in. Which is then where, so that's kind of a cliffhanger in and of itself. But then, we then move to the book of Leviticus, which is then, the Lord summoned Moses and said to him from the tent of meeting, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any of you shall come near, you shall bring an offering of livestock to the Lord. You shall bring your offering from the herd or from the flock." Right? So in this moment, God is now giving Moses, as he's standing there listening intently, this is what you have to do if you want to come in here. Right? He's saying, and I'm giving this to you. We think often of sacrifice as us giving something to God, or to a god, or like whatever it is people sacrificed to back in the day. This is very different. This is God telling the people, I'm giving this to you so that you can then give it to me. And I think there's probably quite a bit of wisdom in that. We have initially 5 sets of offerings that get made. The first one is a burnt offering or ascension offering, depending on the word that you choose to translate as this. And ultimately, it is when you take an animal, you slaughter it, and you burn the whole thing. At some level, it is a complete waste. It is taking the animal and giving it solely to God as a odoriferous offering. We might make a comparison to this in terms of incense. Okay, I remember, my parents are divorced, and whenever I'd go to my dad's house, I got $20 every time to go to the fireworks store. Okay, and because where we lived, you could buy fireworks year round, and they were in the country, and so you could shoot off fireworks anytime we went. It was great. Who would become my stepmom, her mother was named Joanne. And Miss Joanne was always like, "Why are you doing fireworks? It's like burning money. Just set a $20 bill on fire." Okay? Which at some level she's probably right. Okay? That's kind of like what incense is. Right? It's just setting something on fire and letting it burn. Okay? I worked for a church in college that the incense line was actually the second largest line item for the church. It was this Anglo-Catholic parish. The rector there had his own incense blends. He had designated coffee bean grinders based off whatever. He would zzz, 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 and he'd mix it together. He had his Lenten blend. He had his Easter blend. He had his Faria blend, right? He was a very interesting fellow. Trey, I love you if you're watching this, okay? Right? So it's just burning money. And that's kind of what it is with this. And part of the Levitical responsibility was to do this every morning and every night. You would slaughter an animal, like clockwork, every day. And that you would offer it fully to God. That the scent would be part of the sacrifice. Here we start to see a little bit of why when we do the Eucharistic prayer, we acknowledge something that generally we don't really pay a whole lot of attention to. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. Right? Why is Christ coming again? Because of the ascension. That some of the Eucharistic prayers actually name the significance of the ascension as sort of the completion of the ritual that gets made. That without the ascension, it's incomplete. because ultimately it is the full sacrifice moving into the presence of God. That it is the smell, the vapor, and right, we can see it, right? Again, imagine the fire coming up, the smoke, the smell, that eventually the smoke dissipates. And it's gone somewhere, presumably. It might as well be to God. And I don't think that's because they think that right, heaven is up here and whatever is down there, but it's sort of like it's moving beyond the temporal world into the spiritual realm. And that's sort of what they're looking at here. So twice a day, every day, that it was whole animals sacrificed, and that was it. We then have what is known as a peace offering. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped one. I'm going to do this one first. We have a first fruits offering. The first fruits offering, or the grain offering, was essentially that whenever you would begin to harvest a new thing, you would bring some of it as a sample. It would be brought to the altar. A portion of it would be burned as a sacrifice to God. The priest would then take some home, because if the priests are doing this, that means they're not out here doing the farming and the herding and all of that. And so it was like how the priest got paid, basically. And that you would then take the remainder of it home. So you would bring your portion, right? So if, I don't know, apples, right? We do apples up here, right? The individuals, right? So this was part of your obligation, that whenever you started harvesting whatever it was, right? I don't know, back in Virginia, asparagus is starting to shoot up out of the ground. And so you would bring some of your asparagus, you'd clip your asparagus on the first harvest, you'd bring it to the temple, you'd burn a couple little stalks of it, the priest would get to take home the rest. Okay. And that it was only that one time though. So it's not like every time you're harvesting, it's the first fruits of this, right? The sampling of every sort of season that would come up. So we would have that. Then we would have the peace offering. The peace offering was essentially community development. We would look at this primarily as or like a harvest dinner gathering. Y'all did, I think y'all had annual meeting recently, right? There was kind of a big breakfast, little to do with that. That would be what a peace offering was. It was all about the community. In fact, if someone came and they were going to slaughter an animal, right? We'll learn in Leviticus that anytime you slaughter an animal, it has to be done at the tent. You can't be doing this like in your backyard. You got to bring it, you got to slaughter it, and that the peace offering is then that you then take it home and consume it and share it. Right? It is a commandment to share it, because you get tonight to eat it and tomorrow night, and after that it becomes unclean, and you're not allowed to touch it. And so in order to not be wasteful, you must share with all of your neighbors. Right? What a great mental image of how our life is supposed to be. Right? That we take what we have, we offer it to God, and then we go back and we hang out with our friends and enjoy the meal. There's also some very interesting things if you get into chapter 7, where part of the peace offering, also known as a well-being offering, it involves little cakes of bread called wafers, where it is water mixed with oil that you're supposed to bring and present as part of this well-being offering. When it is done, are you ready for this? In the context of Thanksgiving. That when we do our community life here at St. James, at any congregation, we continue to participate in these three offerings. That presence candle that y'all have burning at the front, y'all are burning money. There's no reason to have it other than it's what we do. Okay? It is, I don't know, it's like $12 a week. Okay? But we burn that perpetually throughout time. Our first fruit offerings, we have this in the form of the plates that we pass every week. It is not so much about what harvest season that we're in, but it is about taking what we've gathered and returning the first portion of it to God. That is then partially given to the priests, but is then spread out amongst the community. We have our peace offering that we do every Sunday. But then at some level, I think this is still better exemplified when we have like parish events, right? A Thanksgiving meal as a family, as a parish family together. That this is, right? This is their ritual system that we live into today without realizing it. And that part of this ultimately has to do with the life of the animal. That the animal is, or that life is sacred. Remember that we had Adamah, Adam, Dam, right? Dam being blood. That the blood is the life. It is why there is a stipulation: you are not allowed to consume blood in any form. Right? Whenever you slaughter an animal, you have to drain it of blood. This is one of the kosher laws. And it is because you shall not consume another entity's life. It's really sacred when you think about it. How this is set up is meant to communicate a reverence for creation that, I mean, I have to say, what is holy better? Like that sort of process, or like the commoditized Tyson whatever thing that gets delivered to Tops, where I have no concept of what goes on in that slaughterhouse, nor do I want to. Okay, right? I don't want to know. Don't want to know what those conditions are for those animals, right? Because at that point, they are simply, I don't know, a commodity. They have no life in them. But this system like perpetuates that. We then have two other offerings that get made. The first is a purification offering, and the second is a sin offering, or what we might call an atonement. Yes. And these words mean something different to us than what they meant then. We are going to get into next week the aspect of what is pure and what is holy and what is common, what is clean and what is unclean, and that paradigm drives an awful lot of the imagination of the people. The things that are considered clean versus unclean are not moral things. They are very common things. For instance, how many of us have ever experienced diarrhea before? Okay? You have been unclean. No moral fault of your own. Okay? My wife will tell you that if it's because I ate Taco Bell, then that is a moral failing. Right? But by and large, right, there is no moral failing in these things. In fact, there are a number of times that we can point to Jesus becoming ritually unclean, which I think is part of the great mystery of the incarnation, is how that which is holy touches that which is unclean. Right? That's when you start looking at the healing miracles of Jesus, he's ticking the boxes of all of these chapters in Leviticus of the people he's not supposed to touch. This is that we hear, or guilt, T. That we talk about a guilt, feeling guilty. We feel guilty when we do something wrong, right? More or less. That having a purification thing, there wasn't really guilt with that, right? In terms of like an emotional response. It is simply, right, that when a woman has her period, when a woman gives childbirth, all of those things make everybody unclean. And it is simply a pause between normal life and sacred life. And that in order to be purified, you had to come and you had to do a certain sacrifice. You had to bring something to the temple. It had to be slaughtered. You'd eat it. You'd take it home. You'd eat it, and life would go on. This is Candlemas, the Feast of the Presentation, because once upon a time, it wasn't called the Feast of the Presentation. It was called the Purification of Mary. that in order to fulfill her obligation 40 days after the birth of Jesus, she had to bring 2 turtle doves and slaughter them at the temple. And that was what she did. And that it is fulfilling that offering, right? That we're not going to say that Jesus sinned by being born, right? There was no moral failing in that. But he was made ritually unclean by that process. The last one is a sin offering, and that is when you have done something wrong to somebody else, or something, not even having done something wrong, but when somebody requires restitution from you. In the book of Exodus, one of the things that it talks about is if you have an ox, and the ox happens to gore your neighbor and kills him, you have to pay restitution to your neighbor. And that generally means you have to kill the ox, do that. But if you knew you had a bad ox, and you were negligent in taking care of your ox, and your ox gores your neighbor, you lose your life. Yeah, yeah. So if a tree falls on, yeah, yeah. Curiously enough, it's the amount plus 20%. So, Doug, you know where to go with that, right? Everybody's talking about depreciated value, and I'm like, where's my 20%? But this sin offering is when Jesus in the Gospels talks about you that sinned against your neighbor, like if you've not been reconciled with your neighbor, go and be reconciled, leave your gift at the altar, go and be reconciled, then come back and complete the sacrifice. That what Jesus is saying is you can't do this and not actually repair the relationship. And I think that there's some wisdom in that. We can't just write a check to make it all better, right? That it requires like long-term healing. Yeah, yeah. Restorative justice. And I mean that I have experienced the challenge of like racial reconciliation work is a lot of time it gets reduced to check writing. And that's just not the intent of it. I mean, from a political perspective, we'd say, yeah, that's kind of a big part of it. That when we look at money, particularly in our culture today, right, money is a symbol of our gifts, skills, abilities, et cetera, et cetera. That dollar bill in my pocket doesn't really mean anything. It makes good kindling to start a fire, but that I can't do anything with it. Like back in the day when we were in Virginia, once upon a time the rector at the church I was at was paid in tobacco, and that was his payment was tobacco, and that they didn't have dollar bills then; they got tobacco leaves. And that this sort of agricultural system made a whole lot of sense. But for us with money, right, that cash is the symbol of what we do. Our experience, our expertise, our learning, all of those things, our skills. And so we bring it. And Jesus says, right, if you've not actually done the work of reconciliation, then leave your gift here at the altar, go and do that work, and then come back, and we'll complete the sacrifice at that point in time. And skipping ahead to the end, when you get to the end of the Leviticus, it says ultimately that when everything starts to unravel and everything starts falling apart, the thing that you have to do is you have to confess the sins of your fathers and your fathers' fathers. And that will be the thing that restores Israel, or the nation, to its wholeness. It's just really interesting idea. Right here they already have an understanding of generational sin. We might call it today generational trauma that gets passed down through lives, and that here's how they're dealing with it, right? That they're confessing it and that they're making an atonement offering for it. Atonement, I think this is going to be my last thing for tonight. Atonement in this sense has two meanings that we may not necessarily see the connection to, but there is certainly in their imagination, these two things are very connected. The first is this sense of covering, right? That a payment that sort of takes care of the action, but then there is also restitution, this extra 20% that gets made. And that the atonement is first the restitution between God and the person, and then the restitution is between God and the neighbor. And that both of those form the atonement and how they act and live with one another. Next week, we're going to start with chapter 8, which is we've gone through this whole list of sacrifices. Now it's time to do it so that we can go into the temple or into the tabernacle. And so we're going to read the story of Aaron, the ordination of Aaron and his sons Nadav and Abihu, and then ultimately how Nadav and Abihu mess up. Last week I talked a little bit about the structure of Leviticus, and that you get these sort of these teaching portions. So the first one we did was sacrifice, which we've done today. Next week we're going to get ritual failure. What happens when we mess up? We're going to get a series of teaching of what is clean and unclean, purification law, that culminates in the Day of Atonement. We will then have a series of moral teachings that goes into the story of the immigrant. And then finally, we get a little aspect of calendar and Sabbath. And we remember that Leviticus comes in between Exodus and Numbers. Right? Where the pattern is Egypt to wilderness to Sinai, and then Numbers is Sinai to wilderness to promised land. And that this is in the very midst of this traveling through their journey. That all of this is taking place at the foot of Mount Sinai for the first time. And that when God will inaugurate all of this, then God in the cloud is going to pick up and move. But that's not going to be until we get to the book of Numbers. That all of this is taking place at Sinai. And the central pieces of it are the atonement, surrounded by purity law and moral law. That here we get the stories of immigrant and ritual failure that we will see balance each other. That it is ultimately pointing to this. And so our plan for how I'm going to tackle this is that we're going to do these sections together. And so next week we're going to do ritual failure and then the understanding of what is clean and unclean and why that distinction gets set up. Then we'll do the Day of Atonement with the moral instruction that's given with it. Then we'll do the story of the immigrant that culminates in Sabbath and the imagination of what kind of society they're trying to produce having done all of this. And then on our last week together, we'll look at how this all fits into the Christian story. Because I think by then it should be glaringly obvious about where we're going. Okay? All right? Very good. Thank you all so much. What questions can I answer for us tonight? If you can do, so next week is going to be Leviticus 8 through 15. 8 through 15. And it's going to get repetitive. Breaking it out in this way, I would encourage you to notice what you associate with Leviticus and also what isn't in here. Okay? Because particularly the purification law is very specific, right? See if you can determine what is the one commonality between all of those things. Because in their imagination, wow, that just got loud. In their imagination, they saw that as very connected. And it's a fairly important thing. All right? Yes, ma'am.
Back when you were showing structure with all of you up front and the priest, and then the congregation goes to the priest, and then they're supposed to bring the world in.
Yep.
And you kind of said something that, by not doing that and focusing on chosen ones, they sort of fail in that.
Yes.
How do we not interpret that? Which I don't believe, but
I think if you were to ask the early Christians, they would tell you it's incomplete. Right? Jesus is the fulfillment. And I mean, at some level, to say that's what we're building to. When we get to the story of the atonement, Jesus, right? Jesus, the human, who is a tree, gets hung on a tree. And that according to tradition, if you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, upstairs where Jesus is, where the Golgotha, the place of the cross is right there. Do you know what's on the floor underneath him? The grave of Adam. I mean, like, they're not, like, it's very clear what they're going for, right? That I think where we have to sort of, I guess, give some intellectual honesty to it is in, right, is Jesus God or not? And if Jesus is God, then there are a lot of things that people will talk about God that probably are incomplete. And if Jesus isn't God, then I want to go find something else to do with my life because I'm wasting it. Okay. All right. I'm pretty committed to this Jesus is God thing, which does mean, right, that does mean that there are going to be certain things that I have to honestly say, right, I disagree with, right, that I can respect, right. I have lots of good friends that are Jewish, right. So, like, please don't hear me knocking Judaism in it. But when we come to talk about the revelation of God and the salvation of the world, I'm going to commit to Jesus on that one, and I'm going to say that where our Jewish brothers and sisters are going, I don't think is incompatible, particularly. But I will say the mechanism by which we get there is different, right? And that Jesus is a crucial point of that mechanism in order to get there.
There's the story of Joseph when he's in a prominent role in the land of the Gentiles, and his own brothers don't recognize him.
Yeah. Right. The story is on repeat all the way through.
And if we look at the tabernacle in today's world,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're the ones who are supposed to be going out into the world.
Yep.
And bringing.
Yep. Right. And so I do want to pick up on that. So Christian nationalism, speaking of that, they will use the word essentially that Christianity.
Replacement theology.
Yeah, like it replaces Judaism. And that's not really, like, particularly in that train of thought and where it goes, that's not where I'm headed with it, right? But I do think that the early church, right, all these guys, all the Jesus's buddies that he were hanging out with, right, they were Jewish. This is their language. And it wasn't until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 that the Christian church really sort of said, we're not Jewish. Up until that point, they're trying to figure out how much of this Jewish stuff do we have to, like, hold on to in order to be Christian. I mean, that's Acts chapter 15 is them trying to argue whether or not you have to be circumcised in order to become part of it, right? Paul's whole purpose of the letter of Galatians is to make this argument, whether or not we've got to do this. And that I think very much they saw themselves continuing the work of the God of the Hebrews in the world. And at some level, I mean, we do it unknowingly because we don't really talk about all this stuff, but hey, we dress up just like these guys do. Our church is structured just like that was, right? We are continuing and participating in this worldview. We've just culturized it a little bit differently. So. All right. Alrighty, y'all. Thank you so much. I'll see you next Thursday.